I'm Anna Urban, and this is the Wildly Different podcast. I'm going to talk about all the wildly different takes out there on ADHD, neurodivergence, spirituality, manifestation, the meaning of life, trauma, shame, joy, purpose, and of course, all the actionable, practical strategies from the super scientific to the super esoteric. Some episodes will leave you with more questions than answers, but that's exactly the point. Is ADHD a disorder or a gift? Are we here to hack our time or maybe even to reimagine what productivity looks like entirely? How do we get ourselves to do the things we say we're going to do, even when every cell in our body would rather do something else? Are we neurodivergent, or are we aliens from Atlantis sent here to evolve humanity? Are supplements a scam? What's the deal with ADHD meds, and why do we have so much drama about it? If any of these questions resonate with you, then you've come to the right place. Let's get untamed.
Hello, my wild humans. Welcome back to the Wildly Different podcast, where we break down the nuance, the science, and the soul behind personal growth with ADHD. Today, we're taking it back to basics, all the way back to basics, how to know if you have ADHD. And I find that this is helpful, even if you've already been diagnosed for years, to understand, to get a little refresh of how it's impacting you in your daily life. I'm an ADHD coach. I've been doing this for years, and even I need to be reminded of what ADHD actually is and how it affects my day-to-day life. Ever since the ADHD bubble of 2020, we went from not having enough information about ADHD and it being kind of misunderstood and kind of stigmatized to now having too much information about ADHD. And I feel it's becoming harder and harder to sift through what's helpful and what's not. There's so much out there that it can get really overwhelming. So if you feel that way, if you're overwhelmed by all the ADHD resources out there, you're in good hands, okay? I'm gonna clear everything up for you. And if you're new to my world and just kind of stumbled across this podcast, you may be wondering who the F I am, rightfully so, okay? I'm Anna, I'm an ADHD coach, and I have ADHD. I'm actually an OG ADHDer, if that counts for anything these days. I wasn't diagnosed super early or super late. I was kind of right in the middle, which is, I think, the sweet spot for understanding the benefits of early intervention. And you also got a taste of what it's like to be a total disaster, right? This is a much longer story that I'm going to tell you another day, but I just want to give you a little synopsis because it relates to what we're going to talk about today, which is how do you know if you have ADHD? So I was diagnosed when I was 19. I was a sophomore in college and my life was completely falling apart. This is actually a classic inattentive female ADHD story, by the way. And it's why so many women get diagnosed late in life is because we're really good at overcompensating, at using fear of failure to compensate for ADHD symptoms, which let me tell you, is not a super healthy way to navigate life, okay? I went from being top of my class in high school to drowning in my freshman and sophomore college classes, like to the point where I thought I was gonna have to drop out. I made it to graduation by the skin of my teeth, and I went on to flounder some more in my early 20s. And the reason that I bring this up is that even though I was diagnosed my sophomore year of college and I went on medication, that medication actually didn't help me all that much. It didn't really help. And it wasn't because it didn't work, because it did. It did work. It made me very focused. It was like putting on glasses. However, I was also focused on a lot of the wrong things. I also wasn't taking care of my physical body or my mental health at all. I mean, like most college kids, okay? And I realized that. My study habits were complete shit. My self-worth was in the toilet. I was binge drinking 4 to 7 times a week. I mean, it was truly not a pretty picture, okay? And then after graduation, it really didn't get much better. I did a little stint in public relations and my life fell apart some more. And eventually, I went back to school for teaching. And lo and behold, I passed my grad school classes with flying colors. Flying colors. Like, all of a sudden, I was a great student again. I literally graduated with a 4.0 from my master's program. I went on to be a teacher for 10 years, and that was such a turning point for me in so many ways. It was such a turning point for me in so many ways. I finally learned somewhat healthy coping mechanisms. I realized that I actually could do this whole adult thing maybe. And when I became a mom, I had this other reawakening that led me to coaching. So I actually like to say that I got diagnosed with ADHD 3 separate times, not once, not twice, but 3 separate times. The first when I was 19 and in college, the second when I became a teacher, and then the third when I became a mother. And each time I got a different perspective on how ADHD shows up in my life. And speaking of gaining new perspectives, if you're ready to dive even deeper into how ADHD might be impacting your life and what you can actually do about it, I've got something for you. Trust me, you do not want to miss this. I have a free masterclass called ADHD Isn't the Problem. And it dives deep into what are the ADHD symptoms and then what is the other stuff that's actually going on beneath the surface? Like, what are these self-sabotaging patterns that are exacerbating your ADHD even further? So make sure you go to the show notes to get instant access to that free masterclass. So that brings us to the topic of this podcast. What is ADHD actually? Because ADHD isn't just about being distracted or forgetting where you put your keys. In a nutshell, ADHD is a complex neurodevelopmental condition that affects 4 major areas of life. And I'm going to break those down for you. So it's self-awareness, emotional regulation, and cognitive flexibility. I kind of group that together as one category because it's like this, it's covering all aspects of the self and emotions. And then the second category is attention, focus, and impulse control. So your ability to stay on task, your ability to make decisions and think them through. And then the third category is time management and working memory. So I put these two together because time and memory have a lot to do with each other. And then the last category is spatial organization. And when I say spatial organization, this can also include digital organization. So if you have a hard time organizing your digital life, ADHD may be playing a role here. So an easy way for you to remember the 4 major areas of ADHD is with an acronym that I came up with, FFTS. FFTS stands for feel, focus, time, and space. So the 4 major areas of our life are feel, focus, time, and space. So think of it like this. Feel is your inner world, your emotions, your reactions, your mental flexibility. It's like tuning into your internal weather report. How often do you experience sun and clear blue skies? Are you able to weather an intense thunderstorm without drowning? The second category is focus. Focus is your mental spotlight. Imagine holding a flashlight in the dark. Where you shine it determines what you see and what gets done. But with ADHD, it's less of a flashlight and more of a strobe light. So the spotlight can bounce around or it can get stuck. And learning to aim it is key. The third category is time. Time is your sense of pace. For ADHD brains, time isn't linear. It's either now or not now. I also like to give people this visual of a zoom on a camera. It's like when a camera is trying to zoom in on something, there's like that in-between period where like it's out of focus, and then it like clicks. So with ADHD brains, it's like we kind of get stuck in like that out of focus spot where it's like we're either too zoomed in or too zoomed out. So you can also picture like sand slipping through your fingers, right? So navigating ADHD here in this category is about learning how to zoom in and out, how to focus on something, right? Rather than it getting stuck in this blurry, out of focus space. So the fourth category is space. Think of this as your external world, right? Think of it as like your physical playing field. When your environment is chaotic, your brain can feel chaotic. But when everything has a place, your brain can breathe. For each of these 4 areas, I'm going to briefly explain how they impact our lives through the lens of ADHD. And I'm going to list out some examples of how it may show up for you, how it shows up for me, how it shows up for my clients. All right, so with feel, this is about self-awareness. It's your ability to recognize your patterns in real time. So if you are catastrophizing, right? If you're spiraling, are you able to notice when you're doing that? Are you able to notice when you are spinning out? Emotional regulation has to do with managing emotions, managing frustration, managing rejection, managing overwhelm. With ADHD brains, we do have a tendency to feel our emotions much more intensely. So it's almost like we have no dimmer. It's either on or off. And so having that awareness is really important. And so do you know when you are navigating frustration? Like, do you know when you're experiencing shame? Can you name it? Right? And then there's cognitive flexibility. This is shifting gears when plans change instead of getting stuck. And I'm going to give you some examples of how this shows up. So you interrupt people mid-sentence because you are sure that you'll forget your thought if you don't say it right away, if you don't say it immediately. So do you cut people off? Do you interrupt people when they're talking? Minor feedback sometimes feels like a personal attack, spiraling into this internal monologue of, why can't I get it together? Like, how much do you beat yourself up for things? How much do you shame and blame yourself for things? You avoid starting tasks that feel emotionally heavy because of the fear of that emotional toll. A change in plans can derail your whole day. Or maybe you replay conversations for hours after social interactions. Maybe you rationalize emotions intellectually, like you understand them on an intellectual level, but your body tells a different story. So a good example of this is like, maybe you meditate or you journal, but you don't feel any different after you do that, right? You can also experience overwhelm from small decisions, like where to eat or what to say in a text message. You may experience emotional whiplash. That's a big sign of ADHD, is feeling ecstatic one moment and then feeling defeated the next. Do you often get more upset than is normal for the situation? Do you feel like you can be explosive or unpredictable? Do you or have other people told you that you seem to feel emotions more intensely than other people around you? Like, maybe you've heard things growing up like, you're so dramatic, right? Do you get frustrated very easily? Here's a really big sign, is you have good intentions, but nothing seems to improve. Even when people ask you to change, you can't seem to stick with that change, like with that constructive feedback. You can't organize your behavior over time and make changes. You have a tough time setting goals. Like, most goals that you've set have either been forgotten or they've been total failures. Maybe you can't do things just because you should do them. Maybe you need a deadline or like an urgent consequence in order to get you to do something. Maybe you thrive on urgency. Maybe you have a hard time motivating yourself to stick with a project in order to get it done. Like, you have a tough time persisting with things that aren't interesting, right? You can't resist the urge to do something more fun when you're supposed to be working. This can also be called shiny object syndrome. It's like you're constantly jumping from task to task, especially when things get boring. All right, so the second category is focus. And this has to do with attention. It has to do with impulse control. It has to do with tuning out distractions. So ADHD brains crave novelty, which makes sustained focus, especially when something is boring, a bit more difficult. So impulse control means resisting the urge to act on every thought the second that it pops up. So here are some signs that you may have ADHD. You zone out mid-conversation, and maybe you realize that you missed half the story, or you missed half the lecture. You hyper-focus for hours on tasks that you didn't plan to. You jump between task to task, leaving a lot of them half finished. Impulse buys are your norm. Or like, maybe you're a course hopper, like you jump from course to course to course. You can't ignore distractions and you fall into deep internet holes. This could also look like doom scrolling or just scrolling for too long in general. You multitask ineffectively. Decision paralysis hits really hard for you. Maybe you blurt out thoughts in meetings and then later you cringe from oversharing, right? Or maybe you feel like you're an oversharer in general, in friendships or in situations? Do you feel like you jump to conclusions, right? Do you feel like you have very little patience for waiting your turn? Do you feel like you react too quickly, right? Or maybe do you impulsively start projects without considering all of the steps involved? Like you empty out your entire pantry because you think you're going to organize it in an hour, and then a week goes by and everything's still out of your pantry, right? That could be a sign of ADHD. Or maybe you quit things like at the drop of a hat, right? Maybe you impulsively cope with things like shopping, eating, or drinking. Maybe as a kid you were hyperactive, but now it looks more like internal hyperactivity, like internal agitation, internal spinning. Like you might be sitting at your desk and not moving, but internally you have a million different thoughts, right? Maybe you fidget, maybe you tap your foot or your pencil or you chew gum excessively, right? Maybe you have trouble sitting still. Maybe your thoughts are like a mile a minute, right? Maybe you think too fast or you react too fast, you speak too fast, or you have little patience for people who do things too slow, like who talk too slow, walk too slow. Maybe you have an inability to ignore irrelevant noises or conversations or, cars driving by. Maybe it's harder for you to block out unnecessary thoughts in your mind. So it could be distractions, physical distractions outside of you, or it could be distractions inside of your mind. Maybe it's tougher for you to stick with one thing until it's finished because something more exciting always comes by and distracts you. Maybe your brain's favorite mode is, if it feels good, do it now, right? You can't seem to make yourself do the things that you have to do. Maybe you have no tolerance for boredom. Maybe tedious tasks feel worse than tasks that require more brain power, right? If you don't see the value in it, it doesn't get done. Maybe that's a sign, right? Like you need to see the value in something in order for you to follow through on it, right? You need to know the why and the how, right? Maybe you struggle to delay short-term pleasure in exchange for long-term reward. So these are all signs of impulsivity, distractibility, our ability to maintain focus. All right, so the third category is time. The third category is time. So ADHD time blindness means that deadlines are often the only thing keeping us on track. And working memory struggles mean that we could forget what we're doing even while we're doing it. So these are some signs that it may be ADHD. You often, like chronically, underestimate how long things take. Maybe you forget appointments if you don't add it to your calendar right away. Maybe you often walk into rooms and forget why you're there. Maybe you struggle with transitions, like transitioning from dropping your kids off to starting work, or transitioning from ending the day to picking up your kids. Maybe you procrastinate often, like you procrastinate things until the very last minute. Maybe you forget steps in a multi-part task or project, even if you've done them lots of times before. Maybe you struggle with overscheduling yourself and not having enough time for rest. Maybe you can't accurately estimate how long a task will take you. Maybe you feel like you're always running late, or you feel like you're controlled by the now and the future seems very fuzzy. Maybe you often forget to do the things that you say you're going to do, or you leave a lot of projects unfinished. You get started on something and then you get distracted and then you never come back to it, right? Maybe you can't remember your goals long enough to stick to them. And then the last category is space. ADHD brains struggle with object permanence. So that means if we don't see it, it doesn't exist. So out of sight, out of mind is a very real thing. And this counts for objects and it also counts for people. Like if there are certain people in our lives, like friends, if they're out of sight, we forget about them. And that doesn't mean that we don't love them. It just makes it more difficult for us because of ADHD. It makes it more difficult for us to remember them. So here are some signs. Losing essential items daily, like your keys, your phone, your hairbrush, whatever. You have clutter, lots and lots of clutter. And that also reflects the clutter in your mind. Maybe your computer has 100 different tabs open at all times. Maybe your car doubles as a second storage unit. That could also be a sign. Maybe your closet is a black hole. Maybe you're constantly rearranging furniture. Maybe you have trouble organizing things, like organizing, your kitchen or your bedroom, or you have a hard time with decluttering. So I want to add a very important thing, which is you may be minimizing your ADHD if you are listening to all of these examples and listening to all of these symptoms and telltale signs, and you're like, well, everybody does these things. And that is true. That is true that everybody does these things. However, it's ADHD when it affects your life in a significant negative way, and when it's chronic. So ADHD, this is a big misconception with ADHD. ADHD doesn't create new problems. ADHD doesn't invent new problems. It simply exacerbates the universal ones. So do lots of people struggle with clutter? Of course. Do lots of people struggle with time blindness? Sure. But it may not affect their life in any significant way. And so ADHD, there's like a spectrum to it. So that's really important to note, because I think that for a long time, I dismissed my ADHD. Even after I got diagnosed, there was so many times where I'm like, I don't really have it. Or because I chose to go on medication, I felt like I was cheating. I could do a whole podcast episode on just that thought alone. I feel like I'm cheating by taking ADHD medication, but we'll save that for another day. Now I want to talk about, okay, we know the obvious signs, and maybe you suspect that you have ADHD, or you know that you have ADHD, you're already diagnosed. Knowing these things about yourself is one thing, but actually doing something about it is a totally different thing. This is where it gets really interesting. What happens when you try to do something about your time blindness, for example? Most people jump straight into strategies like timers, planners, productivity hacks, but I do things a lot differently. Let me tell you why that matters and how it changes everything. So you may have this fear of failure. A lot of people do, right? This fear of failure or fear of not being worthy, and it might be tied to your ADHD, but there's also most likely something much deeper running the show. And let me explain why that is. So before I ever took on a single client, I spent a year doing a deep dive into the science of ADHD. I made sure that I knew the ins and outs of the ADHD brain before ever taking on a client. I studied the top ADHD experts, the Ned Hallowells and the Russell Barkleys and the Tamara Rossiers. So when I finally decided to put myself out there as an ADHD coach, I felt ready. I felt nervous, of course, but in general, I felt ready. I felt excited to share what I had learned with the public. And so I, at this point, had been sharing content for years. And so I had a pretty large audience, and I offered a bunch of free calls to get my feet wet. And my second client ever, the second person to ever book a call with me, was a famous news anchor. And I didn't even know who she was at the time, but I could just tell, like, oh, like she's like some sort of reporter or something. And when I asked her about it, she said, yeah, I'm on this really big show that I can't mention here, but it was a major TV show, okay? And in that moment, my little ADHD brain spiraled straight into, this is it. This is my big break. Oh my gosh, I knew it, right? Like, this is a manifestation. She's gonna be my client for life. She's gonna tell all her famous friends about me. My career is gonna take off. I'm gonna make it big, okay? So I give her everything. I give her my best strategies, my best insights, the full ADHD survival toolkit. And about 20 minutes into our call, she looks like bored and honestly like kind of frustrated. And basically what she said to me was like, I already know all of this. What else you got? And I had nothing else. I spent the rest of that call praying for time to speed up so that I could crawl into a hole and never come out. She did not book another session. She did not become my long-term client, but she did teach me the most important lesson of ADHD in that call. And not only her, but I had lots of other clients after her that taught me something similar. What I learned was that ADHD is only part of the problem. It's not the whole problem. There's so much more. That moment led me to a 2-year mission to figure out what exactly holds people back with ADHD. Because if ADHD were the only issue, then medication would fix everything. If ADHD were the only issue, then the timers and the alarms and the planners and the productivity hacks would be enough, but they're not. We don't just struggle with not knowing how to break tasks down. We struggle because of what's underneath the tasks. We struggle with the emotional side of things, the mindset. We don't struggle because we have a harder time regulating our uncomfortable emotions. We struggle because of what causes those uncomfortable emotions in the first place. After coaching hundreds of clients and selling hundreds of ADHD programs and surveying my people, I came across shadow work. And that's when everything clicked. And here's what this means for you, my wild friend. If you're listening because you suspect that you have ADHD, but you haven't been formally diagnosed yet, or maybe you have been diagnosed and you're ready for a revamp, do both. Do the practical stuff, like do the timers and the planners and all that stuff, because it does work, but also do the mindset and the shadow work stuff. Because here's the thing, I promise you, if you only focus on the tools and the systems, you're gonna keep running into the same walls. The wall of, why can't I just get it together? The wall of, what's wrong with me? Those walls are made of your shadow. Shadow work is about getting underneath the patterns. It's understanding why you keep getting derailed, even when you know what to do. Why do you keep showing up late to places even when you know that it's gonna take you longer to get there, right? It's when we uncover those hidden beliefs, those fears, and their emotions that we can quietly catch ourselves in sabotage and turn it around. If you're not already subscribed to this podcast, I highly, highly recommend that you do, because you're not gonna find this content anywhere else. We're going to explore the stories you've been telling yourself without even realizing it. And I'm telling you, this work is the missing piece for so many people. It's been the missing piece for so many of my clients, because you can't out-organize a belief that you're not worthy of ease. You can't time block your way out of a fear of being seen. You can't productivity hack yourself into self-acceptance. Shadow work is where everything clicks. It's where the science meets the soul. So if you're ready to stop fighting yourself and start trusting yourself, you have found your movement. You've found your people. All right, my wild, wild humans, that's all for this episode. Until next time, stay untamed. If this resonated with you, comment the word shadow and I'll send you the link to my free ADHD and shadow work masterclass, ADHD Isn't the Problem.